Card check campaigns have little to do with giving workers information. We were trained to avoid topics such as dues increases in the spectrum of strike. We were trained to constantly move the worker back to what the organizer had identified as that worker's hot-button issues. During organizing training sessions, this is something called re-agitation. The logic follows that if you can keep a worker agitated and direct their anger at their boss, you can pretty much get them to sign anything. Now, that's just a few paragraphs I picked out, but I would just, don't take my word for it, go check out the hearings, fortunately, with Google and all that, they're easy to do. Now, with regard to the secret ballot issue that Stewart mentioned, it's true that technically speaking, what this new process is, which says that if the unions come up with 51% of the cards signed, the NLRA must not or may not order a secret ballot election, and the employer must recognize the union. That's the process we're debating about. That is, as Stewart pointed out, overlaid over the current process of which, if the union gets 30% or more cards signed, then they go to the employer, and the employer can elect to have a secret ballot election. Obviously, if a union, and typically unions get much more than 30% of the card checks, they're not going to go on a secret ballot election with less of an indication of a majority. It would be a rare union that would decide to risk a normal secret ballot election with only a 30% card check, and they only need to get 20% more to get automatic recognition. But as a technical matter, you're right, the secret ballot election survives. I don't think anybody really would contend that that would be an option used by the unions very often. Lastly, with regard to remedies, look, the National Labor Relations Act hasn't been updated for a long time. And maybe really talk about remedies. Certainly, it's not as expansive in terms of remedial relief as Title VII and other laws that have been amended in recent times. There's a little bit of an irony in this case because the amended new remedies under this act, the Employee Choice Act, only apply to employers and don't apply to unions, which we think is just sort of a bit of a, well, reflects the one-sided way the bill is written in general. So that's a kind of a quick overview of the Employee Choice Act. I guess I try to provide a little bit of a big picture for response to it, and a little bit of our concern about the Employee Choice Act. I think that's probably the time.
Well, I want to make sure that we all know exactly what we're talking about. The Employee Free Choice Act will do three simple, very simple, straightforward things. One, it says real penalties on employers who violate the law, up to $20,000 civil fines for unfair labor practices, triple damage back pay when you fire somebody for union activity. Again, remedying the fact that there are no effective penalties on employers for violating the law today. Two, you can't drag your feet in bargaining. You can't engage in surplus bargaining. That you have to negotiate in good faith, and it incentivizes negotiating in good faith by allowing workers or the employer to seek mediation after 90 days of bargaining only for a first contract. It does not allow this method for any succeeding contracts. Seek mediation after 90 days of bargaining. If that doesn't work in a month, then seek arbitration. Now, those deadlines can be extended by mutual consent if bargaining is moving forward. The experience in Canada is that arbitration is rarely used because both sides would prefer to negotiate a contract that they know what is in it rather than allow a panel of arbitrators to do it. But we have to find some way to incentivize good faith bargaining in first contracts. And lastly, the Employee Free Choice Act says workers can get a union and form a union just like any employer can join Randy's organization, the Chamber of Commerce. That workers can get a union and form a union just like they volunteer to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. That workers can get a union or form a union just like they sign up for the U.S. Marine Corps or the United States Army. And I submit to you, if a worker's signature is good enough to go serve this nation in Iraq or Afghanistan, it ought to be good enough to be able to form a union. Randy quoted twice from George McGovern. Well, in a couple of weeks, we will announce that 700 businesses, including members of Randy's organization, have signed up to support the Employee Free Choice Act, 700 businesses. George McGovern does not speak for the United States labor movement. I guess he's still angry that we refused to endorse him in 1972. Workers, Randy said workers need to hear both sides. Employers have access to workers 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week now. This act will not do anything to interfere with employers' ability to speak to workers anytime they want to. 60 million American workers say they want unions if they could form them free of retaliation and intimidation. The problem with what the Chamber calls secret ballot elections, which are a 45-day period between when we file for an election and when an election is held, is that is 45 days of intimidation, retaliation, terminations, and firings. We simply must have a more streamlined process for workers to be able to freely form unions. Randy talked about better employers. Do you know who the #1 user of Medicaid in the United States is? It's employees or associates of Walmart, America's now biggest employer. I mentioned Comcast a while ago. Randy suggested we needed more time to go through the act. With all due respect, Randy, where have you been for the last 6 years? We introduced this bill in 2003. There have been community forums and hearings and town hall meetings and meetings with senators and congressmen and congresswomen, day after day, month after month now for 6 years to get this legislation to work. It was an issue in the presidential election. And finally, Randy mentioned 1 or 2 union organizers who testified in Congress. Yeah, they testified in Congress after they had sold out to Centos Corporation for $200,000. They had a $200,000 consulting contract to provide that testimony to Congress. And employers have access to workers 8 hours a day, every day of the week. Thank you.
Some exercise. Okay, let's on regard to this issue of possible coercion in the workplace. Okay, let's just pretend we're not in testimony at Capitol Hill. I'll just read you the support decisions. Workers sometimes sign union authorization cards not because they intend to vote for the union in the election, but to avoid offending the person who asked them to sign, often a fellow worker, or simply to get that person off their back. 7th Circuit decision. Another decision. On the contrary, both the board and courts have long recognized that the freedom of choice guaranteed employees by Section 7 is better realized by a secret election than a card check majority. 4th Circuit. It would be difficult to imagine a more unreliable method of ascertaining the real wishes of employees than a card check, unless it were an employer's request for an open show of hands. I would agree with that. It would be difficult to imagine a more unreliable method of ascertaining the real wishes of employees than a card check, unless it were an employee's request for an open show of hands. The one is no more reliable than the other. Overwhelming majorities of cards may indicate the probable outcome of an election, but it is no more than an indication that in close card majorities prove nothing. National Labor Relations Act establishes an electoral apparatus to be administered by the board because formal elections and secret ballots best express employees' free choice. With regard to arbitration, I can tell you it hasn't worked well in the public sector. Michael Dukakis even pulled back on public sector arbitration in Massachusetts. My proposal would restrict binding arbitration only to cases where the state's Labor Relations Commission has found municipal officials guilty of bargaining in bad faith. I'm also proposing that the scope of bargaining be limited. Our present binding arbitration has removed legitimate managed prerogatives in the area of staff assignments, et cetera, et cetera. Even in the public sector, binding arbitration has not proven